Welcome in, everybody. You are listening to Resilient Schools on the Bee Podcast Network. Thanks for being with us. I think this will be a great conversation. I'm your host today, Ross Romano, co-founder of the Bee Podcast Network, and it's my pleasure to be talking to Jen Perry. Jen is Senior Manager of Learning Design and Whole Learner at Edmentum. She has worked for over 30 years with youth in educational and community settings. As a teacher, administrator, and trainer, Jen's passion has been to help educators develop an understanding of the importance of social emotional learning and build trauma-informed responses and systems. This work has included supporting youth, administrators, and schools in understanding behavior and implementing transformational change through strength-based approaches. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
I actually wanted to start it by giving you a little bit of a chance to define our show for us in a sense. As we mentioned, the show is called Resilient Schools. And, I think that means a lot of things to a lot of people, right? And there's a lot of different approaches and programs required to create schools and districts that are resilient in the face of challenges, crises, change. So I just wanted to hear from you. When you hear that phrase resilient schools, what does that call to mind with respect to your work and how you think of the term?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. I'm really excited that you asked it because it's something I was thinking about and I was wondering sort of the way in. So awesome. This word resilient. So, as someone who has spent a good portion of my time working with kids who often we use the phrase at risk, I call them at promise, right? In that this word resiliency gets thrown around a lot. And lived for 18 years in Rochester, New York, and my most recent job there was to run a juvenile diversion program with 5 community-based organizations, probation, child protective, and the city school districts. And as part of that, I sat on a council for resilient schools. It was a resiliency collaborative. We had 16 different districts, community-based organizations, hospitals associated with us. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that word, because I think in our culture, we think about resilient as like this rock that can get battered against by the waves,
Right.
and we stand strong. And right, that's such a miss, I think, on the really breadth of that word. And the best definition I've heard for resilient is that it sort of equates to adaptable, right?
Yeah.
That it isn't about just having trauma batter you and staying strong, right? It's about being able to adjust and adapt, ideally in healthy ways, to the systems and the things that are around us that we have to be resilient in. And in schools, we often talked about it as like sort of expect kids to meet the framework and the expectations. And if you come to school and you haven't had breakfast, and we're saying like, no, you have to be in class right now, you have to be resilient, get your work done. Is that acceptable? Is that an acceptable definition of resilience? Or should we say like, we also need to adapt, feed the child, and then, help them adapt and adjust to the kinds of things that their needs present in that setting. So I like the definition of resilient as adaptable.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's we talk about going beyond trauma-informed schools to schools that are ready for anything that's thrown at them. And that looks like a lot of different things, of course, right? There's individual student traumas, and there's the social, emotional, and relationship aspect. There is the pandemic with societal and systemic trauma, both in this, sense of the impact that had on people and mental health and families and physical health, but also the system with schools not being open and needing to be resilient to deliver instruction in new modalities. One of the projects I worked on where we talked about the Resilient Schools project was with the national nonprofit Future of School, which was an awards and then grant-based program for schools or even individual educators who found things that worked to be able to deliver remote and hybrid learning, and needed to secure funding to be able to continue those and wanting to do some of those things. And that was more technology adaptive, as you said, to being able to, okay, this actually really works well. This keeps students engaged. This allows us to deliver instruction in a variety of ways and not be contingent upon the status quo. Okay, we can teach if the school is open, every teacher is here, every student is here, or in our classroom. Okay, then we can teach. If something disrupts that, maybe not anymore, right? So that adaptive piece. What are, I'm wondering, with this resiliency, are there particular, and this, I'm sure you're not going to be able to go through all of them because there probably are more than we can count, but indicators of trauma within a school community when we talk about trauma informed responses, right? And for each school, each district, those are going to be look different, but in order to have that response, we have to figure out what we're responding to. Are there indicators that are most common, or just ways to identify the indicators, right? To say, all right, we know we want to develop our system here to be resilient. First, we need to determine in our unique learning context, what does that mean?
I feel like you just handed me the right question. So there are formal indicators of trauma, like the adverse childhood experiences, assessment that we can do, and many schools do that. And we know that kids who score high on the adverse childhood experience scale don't do as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, we also know it's not like a fait accompli. There are things that we can do that are protective factors once we understand trauma in people's lives that can help them thrive, right? It's not like we say, okay, well, you have over a 4 on the ACE scale, so now your health demographics are going to be terrible and your life is going to be terrible and you're going to like do all these things. What matters is, when we know it, what are the protective factors that we can help build to do that? And so I'm going to go from that to, I think, to attendance in a second. But the other thing I want to say about trauma is that trauma is about perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we often will fall into the trap in some way of thinking trauma happens for people who look like X or in communities that look like Y, right? But we learned even from 9/11, right, that there are people who were present in New York City when that happened who have relatively low trauma from that. And we also know that there are people who were in California who watched it on TV who weren't there, who didn't have anybody who perished, who were very traumatized by that experience, and it changed their life. And so the way that we sort of imbibe an experience and the perspective that we have around that determines whether something is traumatic for us or
Mm-hmm.
not. Now, that said, we know there are common things that are likely to be traumatic: poverty, lack of food, abuse, all of those kinds of things. And that's what the ACEs piece measures. And so I think there are those very clear things that we can look at. If someone's not screening for ACEs, we can look at frequent challenges or demographics. We also need to challenge a perspective when we think maybe out of our frame of reference into maybe a well-off community. Well, what does it mean to have resources? Do those resources match what they need? And one of the examples that stands out to me is I've been in schools where people say, well, they have lots of support. They have all these familial relations, people who show up for them. And yet the person is struggling with something like gender identity, and their family has a perception of where that should fall and it doesn't match the person's. And so that support is quantitative but not qualitative, right? It doesn't actually mean they feel supported. So those are indicators of trauma. And for me, in the work that I did actually in that diversion program, attendance is a great indicator that something's going on, because right, what we know developmentally is kids want to be connected. They want to make people happy. They want to belong. They want to learn. They want to grow, right? So if they're not coming to school, there's something getting in the way of that. And we can ask lots of questions around that. And so I think one of the things we're here to talk about is like that impact of what those things have done to contribute to chronic absenteeism. And there's really good research that if I were to give you only one solution to a very complex problem, connection and developmental relationships are a pivotal protective factor.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many. And I think, part of what you are illustrating in your response is about the mindset and mindfulness about what could be different sources of trauma, and not assuming that it only means a certain demographic, a certain type of, a certain student, that we think, oh, this student probably has trauma in their life, this one doesn't. Or that, even as you referenced, I think in the 9/11 example, there's different ways that things may have real effects on learners and the way that they're able to show up and engage in their learning. It's making me think about a completely different podcast that I recorded last week, which was not resilient schools, but it was about equity and access. But I was speaking to an educator named Eli Davis, who's getting his PhD right now, focused largely on study of epigenetics. And there's a lot to investigate there about historical traumas. And for example, what effect does it have on a student who is an African American student and reads about slavery? Right? Like, how does that affect their psyche and their ability to engage in their learning, and in ways that are maybe invisible on the surface, but over time, when we're not being mindful about what's in our curriculum, what's in our textbooks, are we being more representative of the cultures? And okay, the only things I'm reading about are past negative,
Yeah, right.
very negative things, or even even the heroes of the civil rights movement, who many of whom were assassinated, right? Like, this builds up over time, and it's somewhere in my head that's associated with my identity, not me but a student. And that's traumatic. Right? And there's going to likely be a certain disengagement from a lot of the subject matter, if not school as a whole, where when I'm taught to to learn that, okay, well, when we're learning about people that look like me, it's not going to be a happy chapter. Right?
Yeah,
And
right. Yeah, so I mean, as someone who's a senior manager of learning design, we think about representation and all sorts of things in how we develop. And as a digital product, one of the things that we can do is help create curriculum that allows people to feel it's meaningful to them, that they can see themselves reflected. They don't just see an image removed from or just negative, that there's this sort of broader, holistic understanding of the beauty of the world and the sort of diversity of it. And that can help elevate curriculum to a meaningful piece. So the segue for me, right,
yeah,
from that back to what we were talking about is from a behavioral perspective, and that's one of the things I'm really interested in is the neurobiology of our brain and how that's changing our understanding of how people learn, right? And this idea that emotions come before learning. So you just gave this great example of, like, if I read something and it causes me to have a negative emotion, I'm going to be less receptive to that learning. I'm going to be more disengaged. So
right,
how do we understand now that we have to engage positive emotion to increase the brain's capacity to learn? Super, super important. And so when we learn, learning has to be meaningful. So we know from a behavioral perspective, we're only capable of doing what we have the skills to do. And we're only motivated to do it when it's meaningful in some way.
right,
Right. So,
right,
so you can create meaning, to your point, by innately building something that's going to spark somebody's passion, but that's hit or miss because we're different people and we have different passions.
right,
Or we can build a connection to say, this is going to be important to you in your goals and your future plans.
yeah,
Or we can say, the people here meet your needs,
yeah,
right? And so, like, to me, that's the thing that's going to be most, like, that's the easy win in some ways, right? That's the connection piece. So I'm going to give you an example. It's a story. My son knows I tell it. I have a 26-year-old who had ADHD, had some sensory issues, struggled early in school with things like writing, even though he's very good at writing. And here's something we can all relate to. So picture a subject that you hated. You just
mhm,
didn't like it, but you loved the teacher. Just loved them. did that make it easier to go to class and learn? Like, if you think about that teacher, for him, it was his English teacher, and she just knew how to pull the best out of him, and he didn't avoid the class because he wanted to see her. Versus he loved math. He went through calculus in high school. He went to college. He went in, he's like, for fun, I'm going to take calculus 2. I don't know, right? And he went in, and the teacher had his back to him and was writing on the board, and there were 200 students, and was very sort of clinical about it. And he was like, I can't take this class. I'll end up hating math.
Yeah.
So, right, what is the pivotal point that allows you entry into learning? It's that relationship piece.
Mhm.
And the Search Institute, who's been around for a really long time, right? They started maybe almost 40 years ago looking at the developmental assets, like 40 developmental assets, internal, external, protective factors that help us thrive. And to your point earlier, help manage trauma, right? Trauma-informed care around ACEs. Created what was most impactful. And I think intuitively, we all know this, teachers know this, and it's the relationship. So they've created like a framework that helps, a rubric that helps teachers look at how they can measure connection and developmental relationships with kids, because we know that that can do so much. So what's happened to connection that has changed and had such a negative impact on chronic attendance?
Yeah.
Right? That's the conversation point.
Yeah. And even kind of as we're sort of transitioning into that a little bit and talking about the attendance piece, I think there's even a little more to extrapolate about the relationship between educator engagement and student engagement.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've talked about a lot on a lot of these podcasts, is like we put so much of this emphasis on student engagement, and that conversation isn't always integrated with the conversation about teacher burnout and teacher retention, attrition, turnover, and all of that, and understanding that there has to be a relationship right there. Like, how do we expect the student to be engaged in their learning if their teacher is totally burned out, disengaged, etc.? In contrast, the example you gave, this is not my favorite subject, or it's one I'm struggling in this class, but this teacher really loves it. They're engaging. They're clearly putting the effort in, and so I'm more likely to see the possibility there, see the potential. If it's a math teacher, me personally, like, math was never my favorite subject. I was fine in it, but it didn't strike me as the most interesting. But when I had a teacher who clearly loved math, it would say, well, I guess it is possible to love this, right? Like, it might not be me, but at least it's like, it's it's not something that it's not everybody's least favorite. Some people love it. So and it just makes you a little more interested, a little more willing to see their point of view. But as we work our way into, I think particularly some of the conversation of chronic absenteeism and all the factors related to that, is there a little more to be said about at least the importance of integrating these conversations and saying, let's make sure that we are keeping our educators supported and engaged in their work, because that's in the classroom, that's probably going to be the number one factor on those students, or at least our number one resource in being able to to have a response to student traumas or disengagement. Is we need those educators to be really ready for that task.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many lessons in that, and where we ask people to model skills that maybe they have not developed themselves. Like, one of the things that's happened in 30 years of education is like the perspective on what we're supposed to do has shifted. So right now we hear that teachers like, well, we weren't trained to be social workers. We weren't trained to be all these, different things. Absolutely, right? We don't even do well in schools of higher education for teachers in looking at behavior management. That's, typically not an in-depth topic that people go into. And so as things have shifted and those skills have been more required, we sort of run up against a wall. In the same way, administrators, right, have had a perspective for years that educators, that anybody in a job comes to school and leaves their emotions at the door and just figures it out, right? But if we actually believe and understand now, because we can see from MRIs and brain and mapping the brain that emotion is connected to our ability to learn and grow and be present, then the premise that we leave our emotions at the door is just, it's not, our brain doesn't work like that. It's integrated.
Right.
So that's true for everybody. It's not just true for students. And so that means administrators also have to have a new set of skills around how they interact with staff and coach and support and think about wellness and all of those kinds of things. And in order to create a staff that can trickle that down to students, we have to model that from the top, from our systems and from all those pieces. One of the things, actually, as someone who's worked in trauma and social emotional learning, that has been really made me optimistic actually about COVID, was that we shifted our lens from a particular population that struggled to everybody. We went from like those kids or those people who have this problem to, oh yeah, everybody needs support, right? Like all my coping skills didn't work during COVID either. What am I going to do about this? And so we've really normalized this understanding more. We still don't have the time to do, or the money or the resources to do all the things that we need to do. But I think from a mindset perspective, we're less judgy about the fact that we need to support everybody. And I think that's a good thing. And so I think you're right that, like, thinking about there's a project in the resiliency consortium that I did that we taught schools, and it sort of nods to this. It's called the DOT project. And it's a mapping of a school's connection. And so you first think, okay, well, I'm mapping students who are connected, but really it's also about teachers, to your point. So this is a nice bridge. The activity is basically you have students put a dot next to all the people in the school they feel connected to. Everybody, bus drivers, secretaries, lunch people, everybody. And with littles, you could do pictures if you wanted, but we'll talk about it from a like middle and high school perspective just for now. And at the same time, you have teachers put dots next to the kids that they feel connected to, right? There's a lot of things you can do with that data. You can look at that data and you can say like, okay, well, Johnny doesn't have any dots. And oh, by the way, Johnny flags on attendance all the time. Maybe that's telling us a particular story. But from a teacher-student lens, you can also say, well, did Jen note that she's connected to lots of people, but lots of people didn't note that they were connected to Jen? So is there a perception difference between how I, as the adult, feel like I'm relating that makes me think I'm connected that isn't translating? And so as an administrator, I can look at that and I can say, oh, well, that's really interesting. Like this person, Jen, feels like she's doing a great job, but there's a miss somehow. So what skills do we need to build? What supports does that person need in order to be more effective? And Ross, marked that he's connected to lots of people. And guess what? They also marked that they feel very connected to him. So maybe Ross can help us skill build around what are the essential things that we can do to help build those connections. And so the trick is to not use that as a punitive exercise, but to use it as a growth and learning exercise to say, okay, everybody, we only have the skills we had experience and exposure for. Now I have to create experience and exposure for people who don't have those skills or who feel like they need more support.
Yeah.
So yeah, 100%. It's got to be across the board to really create that kind of cultural shift.
Yeah. And so if it's not already clear to listeners, I'm sure they know coming into this, the importance of connectedness and engagement and approaches that account for student trauma is one of the consequences of lack of connectedness, disengagement, et cetera, is absenteeism and chronic absenteeism.
And lower GPA.
You're right. Which, of course, there's all these factors that can inhibit a student's learning and performance when they're even in school. But if they're not there at all, going to be a lot more difficult. This is something that there was increases widespread during the pandemic, but hasn't necessarily been a full bounce back. But it's something that you specifically have looked at when you're part of the Rochester City School District in New York. And I'm sure you've continued to keep up with what's been happening. What have you learned as far as what were the causes of the chronic absenteeism? What's been happening with that as time has continued?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And this piece of why it hasn't rebounded to
Mhm.
me is slightly different than why it was there to begin with, right? So
Right.
one of the things that we know about chronic absenteeism is that there's inequitable representation across the school districts where that happens, right? So typically it's higher pre-pandemic in schools who are more challenged than other schools, right? So all the trauma things that we talked about have an impact on attendance. And then you add in, so why is that? I think increasingly school has not translated well into people's understanding of meaningfulness, right? So in the juvenile diversion program that I would do and in non-secure actually, and this is actually true in the boarding school that I worked at, is I would say like, how do we create meaning for your story? And if someone said to me, well, I want to be an NBA star. I mean, I had lots of kids who said, I want to be a rap star, I want to be an NBA star. Now in no matter what school it's, I want to be a YouTube star, or I want to be like a gamer, I want to make my money that way, right? In any of those, it's very hard to make the leap to say, how does this matter to me? How does being in
Uh-huh.
school matter to me, right? So with the NBA example, I would say, well, do you know what the NCAA guidelines are for enrollment? Like if you want to play college basketball, you actually have to pass certain classes and there's like a threshold. And so let's look at what you're taking and how does that fit in and how do we create meaning for this vision that you have? And I don't think we've moved off of our traditional understanding of school and how we implement schooling to help bring kids into that story. And unless they're already so far out of that story that we're really reaching to pull them back in, right? And then we vary our approach. But the other thing that's happened, right? We know that kids, particularly in middle and high school, want to belong. And typically 30 years ago, right, the only place you could go to have a peer group, a social group to connect and belong was school, right?
Yeah.
That's where you wanted to be generally. And if you weren't there for academics, you were there because you could, you know, have friends, play sports, do all those kinds of things. With the increase in social media, right, more and more kids have found ways to meet that sort of essential need for having a peer group or belonging. Whether or not it's effective is another conversation, but through that platform. And there's a sort of quick, dopamine, serotonin, oh, I got my like, I'm
Mhm.
excited. Like it's hard to compete with that immediate gratification. And what happened during the pandemic is we took kids who were already in these sort of tenuous situations with connection in school and we moved them into a fully virtual world. Now, look, I work for an ed tech company and I believe that virtual curriculum can be supportive of teachers and in fact free them up to do some of the connective things
Yeah.
that they need to be able to do in order to meet the needs of students. But that said, when we talk about that immediate gratification of social media and things online, that the pandemic sort of further disenfranchised kids. And then what do we do? Then the pandemic ended, we brought them back in and we said, all right, let's get back to normal.
Hmm.
And everybody was like, well, wait a minute. Now I have this different perspective on what I'm doing and how it fits into my life and whether it's meaningful and whether I need it for social or academic status. And people started asking questions. Parents got more involved. They wanted to know more about what kids were learning and how that would be valuable. I mean, it's really actually positively impacted the rise in career and technology
Uh-huh.
training and the desire for that. I don't know if you remember when kids came back, there was a TikTok challenge. And it was like kids were going in and destroying bathrooms in schools and
Mm-hmm.
like destroying their environment. Right. And to me, that was like you talked about indications early on.
Yeah.
The biggest indication of feeling disconnected. Like I don't care about my environment so much that I actually care more about the like I'm going to get for doing damage to something.
Yeah.
And then what do? We suspended them.
Hmm.
And what we really need to do is pull them in and say, well, how can we connect to you? How can we create meaning for you? How can we make this a valuable place for you? Which is, it's hard because obviously for safety and for all sorts of things, we make other decisions. But for me, that really illustrates this like disconnection between what kids are articulating their perceived needs to be and how we are trying to engage them or connect with them. And so we've got to start to shift that and figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, part of what's standing out is the school system had not traditionally done a good enough job of making the case for its importance to students, right? Why schooling is valuable and why it is universally valuable, regardless of what you may believe you want to do in the future. And there's always been small examples of that. When am I ever going to use this, right? Kind of thing. And there's ways to make that curriculum more relevant about, if it's math and financial literacy or whatever the case may be, small things to say, look, these are all things that are valuable to know. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to go into X profession where this is the main thing that you use, but it relates to life. But then post pandemic, once students through that process had learned that, throughout each of their individual experiences of trauma and all the challenges associated with it, once the pandemic was ending and schools were reopening, they had learned that life goes on if I'm not going to school every day. And,
That's right.
Now you really need to make, if you want to just revert back to normal, now we need to make the case when in most of the rest of society, right? Other professions, the workforce, etc., things did not just go back to the way they were. Now,
That's right.
companies do need to make the case for if we're doing in person or hybrid and we're not allowing our employees to work remote, we have to make a case for why
Exactly.
that's a necessity. And then that's the same thing that would have to happen in schools, is to say, okay, why are we doing this? What does this look like? And yes, if students who are already engaged by a thread, maybe
Mm-hmm.
by the thread of proximity, and not actual emotional connectedness, then lost that because they were no longer there, or they were, sort of part of that kind of invisibly chronically absent group during the pandemic where they really weren't even present in the virtual schooling. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to be done to re-engage them, and it's something that is not easy, but it's not going to likely fix itself, I guess, as maybe
Yeah.
the assumption was. Okay, well, now this pandemic thing is over, and some of these things that we were never quite able to solve in our district during the pandemic, at least now that'll be done. Not so much, because now everybody has had a different experience and a different view on it, I suppose, but also presents, I mean, a good opportunity, a good challenge to think more deeply. I think we use the phrase show, don't tell, right? I talk about that a lot with schools, as far as showing, for example, all of the positive things they're doing and being more proactive with that communication and storytelling, and instead of just saying, well, teachers are the experts in this, which if you just say that, it either doesn't make the case or it's antagonistic toward parents,
Yeah.
because it's kind of saying, trust us, not yourself.
Yeah. Right.
Show them that by showing actual examples of what you're doing. And it's the same, the same thing. Show them, as you mentioned, relating the things that they are interested in, these careers, and how they would use this knowledge.
I like the parallel that you used around the workforce adapting, but not necessarily the schools. And for me, what stands out, the phrase that I would use is it's compliance versus collaboration, right? And
Mhm.
so those examples that you just gave about working with parents, understanding the needs, all of those kinds of things, like those are examples of collaboration rather than compliance, which is like, this is our schedule, school's back in, time to show up. This is work. This is when, right? We're in a spot now in general. One of the positive things I think about social media is that it's opened up this perspective of comparison of like, oh, my life could be different. I could see these other options. There are these other things that I can compare it to. It's not just like what happens in my house or in my thing is the way the world is. And so we do need to move from compliance to collaboration and thinking about how to create engagement and meaning at all levels. So I love that you pulled that out as an example there. So one of the things that you sparked is like, so one of the real case scenarios that we used was a school that I collaborated with in Rochester called East High School. It was one of the lowest performing schools in Rochester. I was on the community action committee as part of the program that I was running, where they pulled community providers in to help support the larger needs of the schools. And the graduation rate when we started was 33%. And this year it's 85%, right? Suspensions dropped 90%. Attendance improved. How did they do that? Right? Like, so to me, this is the crux of it. It was a hard to engage population. People were very disenfranchised. People didn't have transportation, lots of ACEs, high ACEs data, lots of things going on. But what they did was they asked students what was important to them. They asked families what was important to them. They created points of engagement. They provided transportation. They really looked at what I would call the eco-cultural niche of the student, like this larger world that they lived in and the things that were going on. They helped bring in providers who could deal with homelessness, food poverty, trauma, dental work, all of those kinds of things, to say, we know someone can't learn when they're in the midst of survival. And so if we're going to ask you to be compliant with attendance, we actually have to be collaborative in terms of determining what's going to allow your brain to function in that way. They also ask students, you mentioned, how is math relevant to me? Poor math gets a bad rap. Generally, that's why I like my son's example, because he loved it. But one of the things that I think is interesting about the rise in career connected learning is, and working on CTE courses that are connected to America Succeeds and durable skills. And so this idea of durable skills are like, companies tell us that while they want, let's say, subject matter expertise, what they want more are resilient workers, to your point. They want people who are adaptable, who can communicate, who can adjust, because we don't even know what the careers are going to be in 20 years. Like, who can be flexible. I had an uncle who was a mechanic who had to learn robotics in order to keep his job. Right? We have to have a growth mindset. We have to do all those things. And so in some ways, school subjects are a vehicle for learning those larger skills of critical thinking and problem solving. And right, math is a great example for learning critical thinking skills and order of operations and problem solving and all of those kinds of things. But we don't intentionally make those connections for kids to say, like, okay, well, maybe you won't need that equation in 20 years, but you are going to need to know how to problem solve, and learning a process for that and learning how to pick out the details of what might have thrown off your decision making is going to be super important. So let's dig in. And by the way, I love math. I love your idea of having a passionate teacher. And so I'm going to show you why. Like, to me, we go back to this idea of how do you create meaning? Like, you have to have that conversation intentionally that says, tell me what I learn. And what they did at East High School is they taught literature through hip hop. They increased the representation. They let kids decide some of the topics that they would find important to them. And I think sometimes we miss with understanding that our subjects, oftentimes for many kids, are just the vehicle for these larger skills that in fact companies want and people want and we need, and might spark joy and passion because kids are exposed to new things in the process.
Yeah, and those are all great examples related to, this is kind of somewhat far afield from this conversation, but I think it relates, is AI right now. And the fact that I believe that it's going to change the future of work and what jobs are in the workforce in ways that are very different from how other technological advancements have, because it's going to relate to, both your quote unquote blue collar, white collar jobs,
Yeah.
knowledge worker job, all different types of industries, all different sectors of the economy will be changed. There might be certain pockets within all of them that are more or less, replaced by or completely revolutionized by the technology. It does present an opportunity for that career connected learning piece to have that relevancy and that connectedness, and also to approach it with like a curiosity and a
Yeah.
humility around the world is fast changing. What we aim to do is equip you with the skills so that you will be able to adapt and create the future. Like, we don't exactly know what that's going to look like.
Exactly.
We've operated with certainty in the past and not been right anyway. But even so, that it's about understanding that that's happening fast. That could be in 5 years, 10 years, and so on. The current trends, at least in the workforce, are you're going to have multiple careers. You're going to change from time to time. And if you have the skills to do so, then you have more choice to dictate what those career paths are, versus being, at the mercy of what's available when the thing that you used to do no longer exists, or, whatever the case may be. But yeah, I mean, that's really important, I think, for students to feel that way, to feel that this is designed for them. And they could be, okay, if you're fortunate enough to become a YouTube star,
Yeah.
YouTube might not exist in 10 years. I mean,
Well,
who
I mean,
knows, right?
yeah,
Like,
so
so
here's
develop as many skills as you can, and then you can use those skills to do a lot of things.
Yeah, so let's bring, like, you threw the AI example out. I don't want to, like, that's not necessarily my world, but let's use that as an example as of a tool, right? And so I might say to a student, like, a new piece of technology has come and I don't know how to use it, and I need
Mhm.
them to set it up for me. And they get really
Right.
excited and they can set it up for me and they know everything about it and they know all those different pieces. And yet we say, well, we don't want you to use that. Right. And so we talk about how we leverage tools and how things are changing and this idea of adaptability. And so when I think about your example of AI and I think about, the biggest thing schools are talking about in relation to that is cheating, right?
Mhm.
And so follow my thread here. Like, I'm thinking about chronic absenteeism, and there are lots of reasons why kids are absent. One of them is kids have anxiety about going to school. They might have learning differences. There are all sorts of, challenges related to poverty. But let's stick with that, like maybe learning challenges piece. Either
Mhm.
I've been out of school for so much time that I don't have the skills to be where my peers are, so I feel behind, or I have some kind of endemic learning challenge or whatever. And I go to school and I'm trying to be engaged and I need spell check. Because if you're like Jen, you can't spell. And
Right.
I use it on all my documents in my life all the time. But if I use it in certain settings in school, that's cheating, right? It's not okay to do that. And so if I use a tool like AI in ways that now allow me to engage and make a student's life and learning more accessible, my attendance is going to go up versus saying, right? And so now I've created attendance. Now I have a kid in a room. When a kid's in a room, they can absorb learning in ways they can't when they're not in the room.
Mhm.
So I've now taken a tool that I feel maybe ambiguous about because I don't completely understand and figured out how to use it in a way that allows a student to become more engaged. And now I have an opportunity to teach them some of these skills that are going to serve them well in their life. And so I do think that, if we pull AI back a field to what we're talking about, there are lots of examples of ways that we can understand the knowledge that kids have about the skills that they need to survive and how we can leverage those tools to re-engage them in being successful in things that they might not be aware that they need, but
Right.
that we can now engage them in. And that's
Yeah.
a great way to start to combat, like, I think as someone who has like I'm a little reticent sometimes about learning something new because I like my ways. Like now we're asking a whole generation of teachers to learn new things. I mean, we learned this during the pandemic when everybody had to learn online learning. And for years before, when we talked about that, people were like, no, I don't really have, no. And then when it came down to it, we learned it. We figured it
Mhm.
out. For better, for worse, in some cases, we figured it out. We can also pull those things that kids think are important skills to them in and leverage those. And that could have a positive impact on re-engaging people, I think.
Yeah, engagement is personal. And so it does require
Yes.
that effort, that work to determine the causes of disengagement and also the causes that would engage somebody. And Jen, we could talk about this for hours and hours, and maybe in the future we'll have a chance to talk more, but we have to try to sort of tie this together
Yeah.
here. And I'm thinking maybe the way to do so is via the whole learner framework. And maybe you can tell us a bit about what that is and how a lot of what we talked about here is kind of represented in that work and in the work you're doing with Edmentum, and really accounting for so much of this critical state of schools, right, in trying to develop an ability to deliver education that is going to be effective and innovate in the ways that we need to be innovating.
Yeah. So I think that's a great way to wrap up. When I think about a whole learner, like there's lots of jargon out there, but I like to simplify things. So basically, I think it's important to look at the things that get in the way of how people learn. And if we want them to leave as successful, thriving, capable people to be engaged in the process of learning what they need, then we have to understand that there's more to engagement than the behavior that we see. They've got to be It's got to be meaningful. It has to be relevant. They have to have some agency and choice over it. And we have to understand that emotions are part of that. And so when I think about whole learner, I think about what are those things, and wherever you are, whatever environment you're in, what are the things that are impacting your students and families' lives? And how do we speak to them? And we know from a whole learner neurobiology, brain science perspective that the brain works in an integrated way. We used to think like, okay, I'm going to give you information into your prefrontal cortex. You're going to remember it. Nothing else matters. Just focus, and you'll learn the skill. And that's just not how our brain works. And there are things like trauma that our brain turns off empathy to survive trauma. Our
Mhm.
brain, doesn't pick up, it picks up on nonverbal and tone before it picks up on content and words. And so how we portray ourselves, how we're perceived, how we engage, and what we put in our curriculum matters.
Yeah.
And so when I think about a whole learner perspective, I think about how do we teach to an integrated brain in a way that's going to light it up.
Yeah.
And I think about it all the time, from the curriculum that we build and the ways that we talk about people and the scaffolds that we put in to meet all learners' needs. And I think about it in terms of creating enough teacher support so that they can be present for the person and not just the task, because really whole learner is about understanding who's in front of you and what they need.
Yeah.
And so, for me, like if we talk about that perspective, we're going to have a positive impact on the people around us. It should help absenteeism, it should help engagement. And it's not, as you pointed out earlier, specific to students. It's about understanding everybody around us.
Excellent. So listeners, of course, can check out admentum.com to learn about all the different things that are going on over there. Is there anything in particular that you'd recommend people to check out if they either want to learn more about some of these topics we're talking about, or if they're looking for support?
Yeah, sure. I just published an article. It's in a district administrators, and that's on the topic of absenteeism and connection. There's lots of resources in that. On a larger scale, Edmentum is rolling out CTE curriculum that is inclusive of durable skills. So we're teaching through that lens of like these
Yeah.
larger skills and trying to create meaning for kids and in the ways that things are connected. And we integrate that into curriculum. And there's lots of resources on our website that talk about those topics. And yeah, I mean, I think, there's look, we believe in teacherful learning. No digital curriculum is independent on its own. We need to support an educator first perspective. And for me, we got lots of resources on how to be educator first and find ways to support freeing up your time to meet people's needs. So it's great.
Excellent. Listeners, yeah, so you can check that out. You can go to edmentum.com to find all the different resources there. We'll also grab that link to the article that Jen referenced. So if you want to click on that, we'll put that in the show notes below. And, if you're listening here, I'm sure you are interested in all these topics, and there's a lot more to explore. Let us know if you want us to talk about these some more in the future. So everybody, hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you want to hear more shows about a variety of topics for education leaders, head over to bpodcast.network to learn about the rest of our 40 plus podcasts. Jen Perry, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.